However, Benedict neglects something like the inverted twin of this capricious God, and this is something which hits the 20th century squarely. On the flip side of Enlightenment skepticism about our ability to know God by reason is a projectionist tendency to turn theology into anthropology, to project our suffering onto God. In the midst of the 20th century, after the Shoah, after 2 world wars, so much brutality, so much suffering, the West looked for a therapeutic vision and found it in a vision of the Father not as utterly distant and capricious, but so intimately bound up with our suffering that he can be said even to need our suffering in order to be the Father. This is not, strictly speaking, a response to nominalism or voluntarism, but certain philosophical responses to the Enlightenment, such as Hegel, Schelling, Feuerbach, Schleiermacher, and others, who tend towards something like the inverse theological vision. Hegel, for example, does not see God as the true font of light and wisdom and the primal origin raised high beyond all things, to borrow from Thomas. Because in the most dramatic way possible, Hegel believes, and I quote, that God is not God without the world. For Hegel, the absolute or universal chooses to move out of itself to the historically particular, a kenotic movement which non-identically recurs as God pours out his divine love and mercy into a common life of Geist or spirit, which must be represented by cult and sacrifice, by a cyclicite, moral community. Citing a Lutheran hymn, God himself is dead, Hegel argues that God unites death to his nature. And so when we encounter suffering and death, we taste the particularities of the eternal divine history. As he puts it, this is not a single act, but the eternal divine history. It is not a moment in the economy of the flesh, as St. Cyril would have it, but it is a moment in the nature of God himself. It has taken place in God himself. For Hegel, God suffers eternally in the procession of time. It is an aspect of his eternal nature. Our sin and suffering is necessary for God to be God. Now, this particular Hegelian vision takes on a greater importance in the 20th century in Protestant thinkers like Jürgen Moltmann, who probably does more than anyone else to baptize the Hegelian vision as a Protestant. A Hegelian divine passibility is exposed in Moltmann's book, The Crucified God, which collapses the traditional distinctions between God the Father's eternal, unchangeable, impassible relation to his eternal Son, and the kenotic descent of the Word into the temporary economy of the flesh. For Moltmann, an eternal and impassible divine nature is a Hellenic metaphysical error, which prevents us from seeing that the Father suffers on the cross in the cry of dereliction. Eberhard Jungel, another Protestant theologian, will write books with titles such as God's Being is in Becoming. Post-conciliar Catholic theologians of the Concilium and Communio schools resisted this, but imperfectly. Karl Rahner reaffirms the classical teaching on divine impassibility and denies passibilism, but by collapsing traditional distinctions between the processions and missions and God, or what he calls the interchangeability of the immanent and economic trinity, Rahner comes very close to thinking about a supernatural existential as a quasi-formal aspect of God's being revealed in and through authentic human becoming, which is not quite God's being is in becoming, but it certainly raises questions about whether this could turn our vision of the Father into a mirror of our own experience. Balthasar attempts to outwit the Hegelian collapsing of God into history through the concept of supra-suffering in God, yet at times Balthasar's own treatment of the cry of dereliction in his theology of Holy Saturday sounds similar to Moltmann's eternal rupture in the relation of the Father and the Son.